We're here with big ideas. We all want to achieve something. And the next speaker we have here is probably the best man to talk about big ideas. He is the founder of Electronic Arts. He is the founder of Digital Chocolate. He's been named Entrepreneur of the Year many, many times. So if anybody can tell you anything about ideas, it's Trip Hawkins. Trip, come on up here. Welcome.
Thanks so much.
Glad to have you.
Appreciate it. So I'm going to cover a variety of topics this morning. Obviously, the big idea is how do you get a successful startup going and get it to achieve its goals. So we're going to touch on a number of topics, including innovation, passion, culture, what the product is, the money, the pivots. And then I'm going to tell you a little bit about my current project, which is called IF. Where do we start? Obviously, you have to have an idea. I like to think that every business that's going to turn out to be any good, it has to have a core, anchor, big idea. There have been a number of different ways that people have talked about this, but there really has to be a fundamental justification for why your business idea is going to exist and why it's going to succeed. And if it's not a big enough idea, maybe you're going into something where you're only slightly improving what others already have. Maybe you're going to be too similar to what others already have. It's going to end up being very competitive. It's going to end up being dog eat dog. It's not going to be worth the trouble. You really need to have a big idea that's a breakthrough, that's something different that nobody's ever seen before. I'm not saying that it has to be a technology, but it can be. It doesn't have to be even a product, but it can be. It can be a concept like it was with Electronic Arts. Electronic Arts was not a product. It was not a technology. It was a system of organizing creative people and sort of expressing and bringing to the world a vision of software development as an art form, and basically taking that core idea and then building all of the business practices around it. Now, you can do ideas that are an incremental improvement. This happens all the time. If you look at a company like Google, they're constantly acquiring companies that are making modest but meaningful incremental improvements in some technology or business model or market segment or platform related to advertising, because that's their core business. I have a lot of admiration for the type of entrepreneur that is good at consistently thinking of incremental improvements. Those are companies, if you start them with a very small amount of capital, if the founders own a lot of the company, and if you can get a quick exit, say within a year, that's a really good business to be in. It's just not how I think. So that's not my style as an entrepreneur. I tend to think of things that are more fundamental, that I believe are part of the future, and that deserve a 5, 10, 15-year investment to build them into something meaningful, which is harder to do. Obviously, it takes longer. But this is part of what you have to figure out as an entrepreneur is what's your style, what works for you. So it's okay to be incremental or evolutionary, but it's also, I think, in a lot of ways better if you're doing something that's really a fundamental innovation. And if that's the case, then you have to stop and worry about the question of timing because you're probably too soon. The idea will form in your head, but nobody around you will understand it. In fact, I'm kind of curious because you guys are creative, you're innovators, that's why you're here. How many of you feel a little bit like an alien when you talk to other people about what you do and you realize that they don't understand what you're talking about? I mean, how common is that? So here's what that should tell you, is that when you try to explain it to bankers to get money, or when you try to explain it to the public to get customers, you're probably going over their head. And you're probably doing something they don't understand well enough to make them immediately act on it and do something about it. So this has probably been one of my biggest issues in my career, is being too early, having a good idea that's going to turn out to be a big deal in 5 years or 10 years. But if you're trying to force it to happen in the next 2 or 3 years, often it just doesn't work. And the market's just not ready. And the whole infrastructure of the system of venture funding and entrepreneurship may not be ready for it. So the timing question is really critical. You don't want to be too early. And of course, if you're too late, that means a lot of other people are already doing it. So that's a equal question. Now, the other thing about getting started is you're going to end up making prototypes. There's a fundamental rule in engineering that the first time you build something, you're going to learn a lot. You're going to be going down a learning curve, and you're going to make mistakes because it's never been done. And after you build it, you're going to have a prototype, and you will have learned a lot of things about how to do it correctly. So the rule of thumb about engineering is that everything, the first time you build it, is a prototype. And what do we do with prototypes? We usually throw them away. And then you start over, and you stick with it, and you rebuild it. And sometimes you rebuild it once or twice or 3 times before you get it right. There's so many companies that the first few product iterations were failures, but they kept learning things and going down that learning curve. And this is where it's really critical. If you don't have this quality of perseverance, if you can't stick with it while you're going down that curve and figuring it out, then you're not going to make it, because it's not going to work perfectly the first time. That's very unusual. Now, a really, really big idea can create a whole new industry, and that's something else to think about. Again, if you're thinking far enough ahead, there can be an entirely new market segment, an entirely new platform, an entirely new industry that might result from what you create, which, by the way, will mean that the media will be far more interested in the stories you can tell about where the future is going to be and what your role is in it. And you can talk about it as an industry category instead of just talking about your company and your product. And in some ways, you can even help recruit competition to help create this new business. I mean, companies like Electronic Arts wouldn't have made it if there wasn't an industry growing up around the same time, with a lot of companies being able to operate the shops and the distribution systems and run the magazines. You know, you needed to have all that infrastructure, and you needed to have a lot more than just one company making the products. And then finally, you've got to think about, in terms of your idea, well, eventually, there's going to need to be an exit. What's the number one fundamental reason you need to have an exit? I'll tell you why. Because you're going to need money. And the people that are going to give you money are going to need to have an exit, because they need to turn the money. So that's just something to keep in mind. You've got to, in the very beginning, think about how and when you might get an exit. So this, since we're on the topic of money, you know the old Hollywood expression, show me the money. Well, you know what? That's not what entrepreneurship is about. If your motivation, the reason if you're here, other than if you're a venture capitalist, if you're an angel investor or a venture guy, fine. It's okay for it to be about the money. But if you're an entrepreneur, it's not going to happen. If the reason that you're doing it is to make money, you're not going to make it. That's very unusual. What really drives success in entrepreneurship is personal passion, you know, feelings that you have about your mission and your purpose in life. And your sense of identity as a person and how you're applying that identity through this purpose and through this goal. If you feel that, and if it's a right idea, and you stick with it, then you are likely to be successful. And eventually, when you're successful, then making some money, that will be part of the equation. But that's one of the ends. It's actually one of the means. You've got to raise money to do it, and it's one of the ends. But it can't be the reason behind what you're doing. The other thing I'll mention is that, you know, it's very common for people to say that entrepreneurs are driven or they have big egos. That's certainly true. And you might think, yeah, you need to be that way. You need to be tough. You know, Steve Jobs has a reputation for being, not being a very nice person, and he really wasn't a very nice person. I'll just point out to you that you don't have to be that way. Here's what you need to do: is you need to apply your passion to being determined and to persevering and being willing to make the very difficult decisions that you will often have to make for your business to survive and to pivot and make adjustments and to let go of things that don't work. And by the way, you will be a warrior, and you will be building towards becoming the prince or the princess in your kingdom. You know, these mythic archetypes from our old fairy tales and our myths and legends, they're deep within us. And that's really what we're here to do. We are the new 21st century warriors that are building these kingdoms. And that's got to be your purpose. So you don't have to be a jerk. You don't have to be a bad person. You don't have to be mean to people. You don't have to be overly tough or driven or have it be about your ego and a preoccupation with your status or your power. Again, it's got to be about your purpose. If your purpose is good, if your purpose is true, and if that's what your identity lines up with, then you will have everything that you need. And then it's a matter of being firm and determined. So this comes back to this question of identity, which starts with, who are you? Who the heck are you? You have to figure out who you are and why you care about what you care about and where you're going to find that reservoir of determination to stick with it, because these things are not easy. They don't happen overnight. Occasionally you hear about a company that seems like an overnight success, like a Rovio, but they made 50 games before they made Angry Birds. I think everybody here knows that. So you've got to have this this core purpose. And I'm a big fan of the power of narrative. Everything is better if it can be wrapped into a story. How many of you are familiar with Joseph Campbell and the hero's journey? Okay, so this guy, Joseph Campbell, many years ago, he studied all of the myths and legends from all of the ancient cultures around the world. He found out that they're all basically telling the same stories. These stories have essentially the same mythic archetypes. And that's all built into our genetic code. And we've been evolving for 1 million years around those archetypes and around those stories. And they're incredibly powerful. Again, you've got to figure out how you fit into those archetypes. And the thing I said earlier about being a warrior, you're gonna find in life you're gonna go through 3 phases in which you're gonna have armor of a different color. You're gonna go from red armor to white armor to black armor. A lot of you are in your red armor right now. Red armor is the armor of youth and the armor of passion and the heart and bloodshed, battles, fights with people, fights with your family. Why are you fighting with your family? Because maybe you want to do something creative and innovative and artistic, and maybe they want you to do something more secure. How many of you had that fight? So you're a warrior right from the beginning, and you're in that red armor, and you're fighting to get established because you want to earn your kingdom. And then you start to have some success. And then you shift into the white armor. I'll tell you what happens in the white armor is that you become an administrator because now you have stuff. You've got, maybe here in Finland, you've got your house or your apartment, but then you also have the place on the lake where you go in the summer, and then you've got the boat, and maybe now you've got a spouse, and you've got children, and pretty soon you have a lot of responsibilities, and you're running a company, and there's a lot of employees that are depending on you to get their next paycheck, and you spend a lot of your day doing things that are administrative, and it shifts you away from the battlefield. It takes the weapons out of your hand. How many of you are in your white armor now? Okay, so you have to be cognizant that this is happening because you can get very mentally preoccupied in these different states. So when you're in the red armor, you can not be aware of the fact that you're being unnecessarily mean to people, and maybe you're too combative and maybe too insecure and a little too desperate about success and a little too frustrated when people don't agree with you. And then when you get into the white armor, you're preoccupied about failure because now you've had some success and you have some stuff and you're afraid to screw it up. You're afraid to lose it. Well, I remember the red armor phase because I was completely fearless. If you guys know the Wagner ring operas, which are based on Scandinavian folklore, there's the character Siegfried. And Siegfried was raised by a step-parent, and the step-parent forgot to teach him something. Anybody know what he didn't know? Siegfried did not know fear. So he just did amazing stuff because he was fearless. When you're in your red armor, you too can do amazing things because you're fearless, because you don't know any better. You don't know what to be afraid of. You haven't failed yet. Then you get into the white armor, you start to have some issues, you start to struggle, and you have things that you could lose, and you get paranoid, and you can get mentally preoccupied to the point where it's hard for people to be close to you, and you're taken away from the battlefield, and you're not really spending time thinking about the kind of things and taking the kind of actions that made you successful in the first place. So you have to be mindful about that. And it can be a very unhappy time period for people, even though they've become successful and they have some of the comforts of life, because they're so worried. A lot of us are actually driven more by a fear of failure than we are by the positive desire for success. And that's what happens in the white arm, is you get worried about failure. And you're actually better off once you've failed a few times. Because after you fail a few times, then you realize that it's not so bad. You realize that you can pick yourself up off the floor and just keep going. And if it doesn't kill you, it's going to make you stronger. And that sort of brings us to the black armor. So not a lot of you are in your black armor. I'm in my black armor. I'll tell you a little bit about what it's like. As you can imagine, black, that's the symbolic color for death. So when you're in your black armor, you've seen a lot of death. Family members have died. People that you grew up with have died. People that you watched on television as a kid have died. Also, products have died. Companies have died. Relationships have died. You've got a perspective, and you know all the things that can go wrong, and you've got this wisdom. And again, this is what I've found as I've gone through these stages, is that what remains is the passion. And you kind of go through these different stages where you have the opportunity to bring your sense of purpose and bring your passion into what you're doing in a different way because of these stages that you've been through. So you just want to be mindful and aware about these things that have to do with your identity and why you're doing what you're doing. Okay, now you can bring this into culture in your company. The definition that you pull out of a dictionary, a group of people that have the same values and beliefs and pass them on from one generation to the next. That is a culture. Now, in a business organization, either you choose that as your form of organization, or you have these two other alternatives, dictatorship and bureaucracy. So all of you out here that are in favor of having a dictatorship or a bureaucracy, raise your hand. Yeah, I didn't think so. So by default, you're going to want to have a culture. Well, how do you do that? What you have to do is figure out how to put together a team that has the same values, and with that team, codify the values and write them down, and basically figure out, well, what is it that we care about the most, and what do we agree on? And a lot of times, founding teams don't bother to do this, but it kind of happens automatically in the very beginning because it's a startup. Why would anybody join a startup if they didn't have the same passion? So it's kind of automatic that you have a consistent culture at the very beginning. But how many of you have been in an organization that had a great culture when you started, and then over the course of your time there, you felt like the culture just got lost, that it wasn't as good as it had been, it wasn't the same kind of place? So this happens all the time, and it happens because the founders are not mindful that they have a culture, they haven't explicitly declared what it is, and they have no business practices to maintain it and improve it and enhance it. And of course, if you have an organization with 5,000 people in it, it's not going to have the same intimacy as when it has 5 people in it. So that's normal. But it can be a much better organization than every other company out there that has 5,000 people in it. And you want to work hard at these things. We'll need to change them over time. If there are significant changes in the business that require pivots, you might have to reevaluate what the values are and keep up with the change. But the important thing is to define them and then to build business practices around them. So those business practices will have to do with how you recruit people, the kind of brand image of the company that you put forward to attract people, how you interview them, what criteria you select for in the people that you hire, and when you review their performance, how they perform against the values has to be one of your critical measurements. And also just how you communicate with your organizations, with your people. These are all things that can be built out. So I'll just give you as an illustration, my current company, I'm a big fan of boiling values down into an acronym. So our acronym is SPIRIT, because we felt like at the highest level, what we want to do is help the world shift from a value system of materialism to a value system based on compassion, for a couple of reasons. The first reason is that it is selfishness and materialism that is causing problems like global warming and pollution and pervasive poverty. That's not all. There have been numerous scientific studies in the last decade that have found that materialism does not make people happy. What appears to make people happy is when you begin to recognize that you're connected with everybody else. Again, we're going through this together. And if you honor and recognize those connections and you relate to people more compassionately, and if you even apply that model of compassion to yourself, you're going to be happier. So that's basically, this concept of spirit. And then you pick some words that line up with the letters in the word. You can see in our case what some of those words are. It just makes it all easier for everyone to remember what the culture is and to talk about it and to reinforce it. Okay, so you got your company started. You've got a great team. You've got a great purpose. You got great values, culture. Well, now you need a product. Well, a product can be a number of different things, but you must start out by identifying a significant market need. There's got to be an audience that really needs what you're going to do, and they need it now, and they're capable of understanding fairly quickly that you are the solution. And then, of course, you're best off if there's no competitors offering a solution to that problem. So that's what you want to look for. You don't really want to say, oh, yeah, I know there's 10 other solutions, but we're better. Because why would the media write about you? If you're 1 out of 11, why does the media think this is news? They only write about news. And same thing, why would the customer decide to pick you for sure out of those 11? You want to be the one and only solution to a problem if you can. And by the way, when you get out there with products, sometimes you're going to have a hit, sometimes you're going to miss. And you have to accept that there's going to be this thing called regression to the mean. However bad it gets, it's not always going to be that bad. And however good it gets, it's not going to be sustained. It's going to always come back somewhere into the middle about where your product execution is. And your product doesn't necessarily have to be a point product, although it can be. You can be building a system. Again, Electronic Arts was a system. Apple, when I worked at Apple, we obviously built a product. What really caused Apple to take off was the Apple II. That was really the company's first commercial product. When I started at Apple, there were about 25 office workers, so about this many people right here. We're in a little office space, and there were another 25 in the back assembling the first 1,000 Apple IIs, which were really just sold to hobbyists. But that product was a visionary product. It was way the heck ahead of a lot of the competitive products, and we knew it. And we were able to build a bunch of market segments around adding peripherals and adding software to that base product. So you can have a hit product, but you can also build a system. You can invent a technology. You can establish a platform. Investors, number one, they love to invest in platforms because they feel like platforms control the value chain. Certainly when you look at an Apple or a Facebook or a Google, Android, et cetera, you can see that they're able to dominate and squeeze the most value out of the value chain. And you're going to get that if you can figure out a way to become a platform. So even if you're not a platform, it's a good idea to try to convince venture guys that you are a platform because that's what they'd rather invest in. Okay, one other critical piece of advice here is get a good lawyer. Get a good lawyer. Did I mention that you need to get a good lawyer? There are lawyers that are constantly working with entrepreneurs and startups and doing deals with angel investors and venture firms, and they know everything about everything. So if you're trying to decide where can I go for money, what would be a good price to charge for the money? Again, you can go talk, if you have the right lawyer, they'll be doing a lot of other deals, and they'll know where the market is. They'll know where the opportunity is. And they can help you address such a wide range of issues. Look, you're not a lawyer, and this is just one of those cases where you need to rely on someone who's got the professional experience and skills. And it's sort of an example where you need to look for places where you can have outside partners. And they might be advisors, they might be board members, they might be agencies that you work with. It might be like a law firm or a banker or a marketing agency. You need to look for the highest quality partners that can help you in all the areas where you need help and just build a really first-class team in every respect. Okay, coming now to the money question. Again, you have to be mindful that whoever puts money in, they need an exit. You've got to be thinking about exit. You don't want to have conflict later on where you don't agree with your investors about what to do with the company. You want to figure out up front, while it's still your company, what you want to do with it. And you want to keep that in mind and try to raise money from people that agree with that will collaborate with you around that instead of wanting to take your company and take it in another direction. As soon as you take investment money, you don't own your company anymore. And it's not a question of who owns what percent. It's just a simple fact that basically you're now working for your investors, and that's the best way to think about it. And as soon as they don't agree with you about how you're running the company, they'll figure out how to get rid of you. And this happens, again, all the time. So it's just necessary to think about how you are planning to grow and exit your company and bringing investors in that are compatible with that. And basically, you have to decide also when you start it with your team how to distribute the ownership. A good simple rule of thumb is that the founder who maybe has the idea and is going to run it maybe gets a third of the ownership. Then there's a layer of 3 to 5 key executives. They will share another third, and then the entire rest of the organization will share another third. And then you start bringing in outside money, and you don't get to decide the price and the shares because that's going to be determined by market factors and value. But for example, it's not uncommon to end up selling half the company to raise the money you need because investors, they're not likely to do something unless they have a meaningful piece of the company. So your number one investor will probably want 20% or more of the company. Your number two investor may want the same thing. Your number three investor may want 10%. And they're not going to be happy unless they have a meaningful opportunity to leverage. Investors don't like to make a whole bunch of little tiny investments because then they have a whole lot of stuff to keep track of and a lot of fires to put out, but without a lot of upside. They'd rather place a small number of bigger bets. So if you think about it, if you only raised enough money to sell 10% of your company, you probably don't have enough money, and your investors aren't that motivated to help you, and you're probably going to run out of money. On the other hand, if you sold 90% of your company, now your team's not very motivated because they don't have enough equity. So again, it's got to be somewhere more in the middle. So at any rate, there's a slogan about bankers that banks only give money to people that don't need it, and that's true. So when you're out there talking to people about money, it's very hard to get, and they tend to have kind of a herd mentality where they're all trying to make the same kinds of investments, and they're all embarrassed when they're hanging out with each other if they make an investment that's too different from what the group think mentality is. So basically, what you need to do is get into that herd and then try to figure out how to get at least 2 of them interested, because if you have 2 of them interested, then they'll bid against each other, and they'll feel like the herd's moving, and it's not just them having a crazy idea to do this thing, it's now that they feel like the herd's moving. The price you'll get on raising money will go up dramatically if you can get 2 people or more interested. Of course, these days, you don't really start with venture money. You have to start with angels. The guys that are really running a venture capital firm, they want to wait till later. No matter what they say about investing early, they really don't. They want to invest after there's revenue, after there's a solid product, after there's traction with customers. Those are the kind of things you'll hear. Although I'll tell you right now, if you go around and pitch people about investing, a lot of times they'll say things to you. Sometimes you don't get a lot of feedback. Sometimes they'll say, come back after you did this, or I have a question, go answer this question, or you need to produce this business plan. I'll tell you what it looks like when they're saying yes and what it looks like when they're saying no. Okay, when they say yes, I want to invest, you'll typically get a term sheet the next day. They'll want you to sign an agreement that allows them to be the exclusive investor. And of course, then you'll immediately go to your lawyer and get advice from them on it. That's what it looks like when they say yes. Anything else they do, anything else they say, it means no. Now, you're all optimists. That's why you're an entrepreneur. You cannot be an entrepreneur unless you're an optimist. And you're going to want to, in your brain, hear what they say, whatever it is, and think it means yes, or it might mean yes, or if we meet certain conditions, it will mean yes. No. They just said no. And what you've got to do is move on to the next one. You've got to be really systematic about raising money and turn over a lot of rocks. I mean, you have to consider a lot of possibilities and just keep going and going and going until you get that yes behavior. But it's not about having several meetings with the same people and trying to answer their questions and do more work for them. That really just means no. Okay, now later on, after you've gone through kind of the venture stage and you start to have revenue and you're building up your company, then there are other kinds of investors. For example, on this slide you see the term PE, that refers to private equity. These are guys that want to invest in a solid operating business that's probably already 3 to 5 years old. You're not likely to ever raise money from somebody like that, but if you want to remain an independent company, you may end up finding yourself able to raise that kind of money. But you have to be profitable, you have to have positive cash flow, you have to be big, and they want to make big investments, so you have to have a fairly high value. So it's kind of uncommon. And then what's even more uncommon these days is to do a public offering. You know, if we were talking 20, 30 years ago, the common route would have been to go public. And the whole banking infrastructure and just everything that enabled all of that to work is gone. So these days, almost all of the exits are through a acquisition, M&A, mergers and acquisition. And again, that's one of the things to think about in the very beginning is who, based on this idea and this business plan, in the long run, who are the big strategic entities that might want to acquire this kind of a business? And it's smart if you develop those relationships over a period of years, well in advance, without ever saying that you have the idea that you might someday sell the company to them. If you go to these guys and say, I want to sell you my company, then they don't want to buy it. You really want to play more hard to get. What you want to do is figure out a relationship that you can have. Initially, it can just be, hey, we're exploring this area and it's probably of interest to you. Let's communicate. Maybe you can find some marketing relationship or some other business reason to have some kind of engagement with that company. And they're all curious all the time about startups, and they feel like they can learn a lot from talking to you about where the future is going. So you can build these relationships, and it's just a good idea to have a short list of maybe between 5 and 10 companies that you're thinking of. Yeah, these are the kind of companies that might be the ones that we want to develop relationships with, that might be the parent company that acquires us in the future. Good to think ahead about that. Okay, another thing you're going to have to deal with is regular changes in the business that turn into a crisis and that are going to require some kind of change on your part. So again, you're going to find out that you're often too early to a market, too late to a market, and you're going to have to make some adjustment. You're going to have to pivot. There's been incredibly dynamic change in the game industry in the last 10 years. I mean, just look at where it was 10 years ago compared to now. 10 years ago, the dominant platform was the PlayStation. Sony had a corporate market value of over $125 billion, and they've lost almost all of that now. That's how dramatic the changes have been. But again, you've got to be thinking about, well, what is your vision for the future, and make pivots accordingly that line up with that, and continue to do the hard work and have the grit and determination to keep pushing forward. But you've also got to have the ability to step back from it and recognize if things aren't working. And if they're not working, you either have to make a meaningful pivot or you have to give up. This needs to happen. So, sometimes you also have to have layoffs, cutting your spending, and it's a really difficult thing to do, to let people go. But if you have a certain amount of revenue and you have costs that are higher than that, there are two possible ways to fix it. One is to raise the revenue, and the other is to reduce the cost. And unfortunately, when revenue is hard to obtain, it's very difficult. We don't have a lot of control over raising the revenue. Revenue only goes up because there are customers that demand more of your products. So you have control over your cost, and you have to let go because you're probably spending a lot of money that's not going to give you an efficient return anyway. And you've got to be able to bring your costs down, and letting go of your dreams a little bit, letting go of some of the people, it's just one of the things you have to be able to do. So just briefly, I thought I'd tell you about what I'm doing. I have this company called If You Can. Some of you may be familiar. There's a famous author named Kipling. He's British, and he created children's books like The Jungle Book. He also wrote a poem about 100 years ago to his son, and the poem is called If. And the poem starts out, if you can keep your head while all about you are losing theirs. It's a very empowering poem about character and about identity. And basically, I kind of rallied around this poem is the idea for this company. And the purpose of the company is to help kids develop their emotional intelligence by playing a game. and to innovate a new model in education. So, it started out with me thinking about, well, how do we fix problems like global warming? And I realized something that Frederick Douglass said a long time ago, which is that it is easier to build strong children than to fix broken men. So it's not that likely that my generation is going to fix global warming, which is kind of embarrassing. But maybe if we teach different values to the kids, and they teach different values to their kids, then maybe there's hope for fixing it. And of course, kids these days are growing up as digital natives, and they have access to computers and mobile devices, and everything's going mobile, everything's going to the cloud. These mobile devices now, everybody pretty much goes around with them right in front of their nose, and we're all becoming addicted. So there's a concern around that the adults have. Parents and teachers feel like they've lost the ability to get the attention of their children because they're in their mobile device. And what are they doing? Playing a game. So there needs to be a new category of applications, because when a child is given a tablet, in the next 5 years, every child is going to have a tablet. When a child gets that tablet, what content is on it? What media does that child get to do? And this is something that the adults always have a desire to do, and that is to curate and organize the content that is available for those children. And they're despondent today because the adults feel like there's very little content for children that has much value. And there's a lot of content that basically is a waste of time. So they worry about that. So wouldn't it be nice if we as technologists and game industry professionals could actually become part of the solution instead of being perceived as part of the problem, and create a new industry that can provide enough of this content to curate a category for the parents and for the teachers. And certainly I felt like I had both the passion to do this. In the last 20 years I had 2 boys and 2 girls, and I watched my kids grow up, and I basically came to understand what kids are like and what they need. So we have this crisis now that deserves a response. There's a very high dropout rate of kids that don't finish school. Everyone is concerned about getting their kids to have better academic performance. That's an area where Finland does quite well on a global level. But this is a global challenge. And certainly countries like the United States spend a huge amount of money in education and get very poor results out of it. We also now have school climate issues just in terms of safety, bullying, new phenomena like cyberbullying from social networks, and all kinds of just coping questions. In America, not too long ago, there was a survey of kids that are in middle school. These are kids basically in the 10 to 12 age range. And they found that 1 out of every 3 was depressed, and 1 out of every 6 was contemplating suicide. So there's a lot of issues around this, and we mentioned mobile addiction. And at the same time, we have this potential as a people, because we have mirror neurons. It's something that was talked about in Jeremy Rifkin's book, The Empathic Civilization. We have a unique capacity as a species to make connections with people through empathy and compassion, because we have mirror neurons that allow us to understand and feel what someone else is feeling. So if somebody came up on stage right now, or if I just took out a knife and cut my arm and blood came out, all of us would actually neurologically feel what that feels like. And this is a unique human capacity. So there's something to be developed there. And this idea of emotional intelligence, it's an idea that's been around for maybe 30 years. It kind of got on radar 20 years ago when the book was published called Emotional Intelligence. It became a bestseller. So it's a fairly new idea. And it has, in the last 20 years, it turned into a curriculum for schools now that's known as SEL, Social and Emotional Learning. And these are skills that everybody used to have, because in the old days, a child grew up alongside their parents in the tribe, in the village, and you learn by watching your parents and the village elders in role modeling and explanations and going to religious services. But today, hardly anybody goes to religious services, and the parents are at work. So nobody's growing up alongside their parents. And this is just an area of human knowledge that has to do with values and character and managing our emotions and building positive relationships. These are skills that a lot of people have not been trained on. You have to kind of figure it out through trial and error and making a lot of mistakes, and it's very difficult. So IF is basically trying to teach those skills and tools through a game. And it's available for free. Again, it's just called If. It's on the iPad now. We built it in Unity. Some of you may be familiar with Unity. That's a tool that allows you to be agile at getting to other devices. And we're going to be offering this game with a free chapter and then subsequent chapters of curriculum and story that you can pay for like a magazine subscription. And the concept here very much is to meet people where they're at. So if today's children are growing up as digital natives and they have access to devices, and their attention and motivation is in a game, then that's where you need to meet them. And then you need to use the power of play and the power of story to get them engaged and to help them learn. And we do that with a funny story involving basically conflict between dogs and cats. And we have a lot of fun with that. Everybody's familiar with dogs and cats, and it's a charming game world. The product model, by the way, is very much like what I did in defining and building EA Sports in games like FIFA. So it's different than, say, the invention of a new game like Tetris, where you have a blank canvas and a creative person just invents something new. I have a huge admiration for that. I'm more of a systems guy, and building something like FIFA involves putting a collaborative team together where nobody has a big ego and everybody's part of a team, and they're obligated to conform to specifications and blueprints and expertise that they don't have. And of course, if you're making a sports simulation, it has to be like the rule book for that sport and the player statistics and what the expert coach is telling you about how to have the computer think and how to move players around. In our case, we're using a similar model, but now we're working with the master teachers that have perfected SEL teaching in the last 30 years. So, these are some of the characters from the game. Again, the game is called If. And just trying to give you a sense of the visuals. We try to come up with a storyline and a visual style that's kind of timeless. Because if you're shooting for children, sometimes you get boxed into a very narrow age range. And when they grow out of that age range, they think it's juvenile and childish because their younger sister is doing it. And it's better to try to think like a Star Wars, think like a Harry Potter, think like a storyline that people can grow up with that feels more timeless. And again, that's back to Joseph Campbell. If you use Joseph Campbell's model, you're more likely to do that. So these are just a few visuals about the game. And we've put together the right team to do this, particularly on the bottom of the slide. Janice Tobin is probably the world's leading authority as a teacher. She's taught this kind of stuff for 40 years, and that famous book, Emotional Intelligence, featured her teaching in the leading school, the Nueva School she was with. And then we also work with Mark Brackett, who's the director of the Yale Center for Emotional Intelligence. They've been around for a long time. This is a shot of some kids playing the game. And one of the things that this game does is it provides feedback to the adults about what the kids are doing. And we do that through a feature called the dashboard. So whether you're feeding back results to a parent or to a teacher, and it goes in through a separate app or a web login to tell them about the progress the child is making and to give them ways to connect with their child and have discussions and help them achieve what's called transference, which is to take maybe a tool about calming themselves down or learning to deal with a bully and apply that in real life. And that's the essence of real educational value. So who cares about what we're doing? We think kids do because we've made a fun game. We're getting a lot of positive feedback from schools, from parents, from other markets, including parents of autistic children love the game. We've been in the App Store now for a couple of months. We've had over 300,000 downloads. And the average review score is 4.5. So 90% of the reviews we get are 5-star out of 5, and that's quite good. Everything we're doing, it's backed up by science now. It's backed up by government support that wants SEL to be formalized as part of curriculum. And because of all of this, we were able to obtain a significant Series A venture funding from Greylock, arguably the hottest venture firm in the world today. These are the same guys that initially funded Facebook, LinkedIn, Instagram, Pandora, and many other companies. So we talked about the big idea, and I think you can probably see that even with respect to If, I don't usually bother to do anything unless I think it's a big idea. I don't always get it right. Again, you've got to accept the idea that there's going to be some success and some failure, and it's just part of your personal journey. And it's very important for the passion to always be there, for you to really understand your core identity and why you're doing what you're doing, and build around your values and build that into the culture of your organization. Be prepared for constant change and hang in there and be tough. Thanks very much. Enjoy the rest of the event.
Thank you, Trip. Thank you, guys. Thank you, Trip, very much. I believe Trip is going to be available for some questions in the back. We have a special area for speakers. We want you to be engaging with speakers.